Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, and it's finally time. Rubber meets the road. All of the preseason preparation gets put to the test as we get real big boy college football. No offense to all those teams that happen to play week 0, but this is the official start of college football season when you hit Labor Day weekend. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And Payne, it feels like a long, strange trip we've been on, but all of those preview podcasts that we started back in June, it's finally time to let it shine.
I feel spoiled having this many marquee matchups in week 1. And, similar to what we did towards the end of last season when we're, weeks with tons of intriguing games, we expanded our coverage. So 4 deep dives, 2 quick hitters. We obviously have Brad Powers coming into the fold, who's going to be joining us all season. He's going to pick a non-Power 5 game to talk about and break down quickly. So a lot more ground covered, it feels like, for this podcast.
There is no doubt about it. And I think people, when they look at the length of these podcasts going forward, they may be somewhat intimidated potentially. But as a result, hey, look, there's a reason we record these on Wednesdays throughout the course of the season. Week 1, a little bit of an anomaly. You got the timestamps. If you can listen to one game, break it down, take it in individual parts, listen to it 4 or 5 times. You don't have to sit there and listen to the whole thing in its entirety. But to your point, a lot of marquee matchups. Spoiler alert, don't look at week 2 because we may be breaking down FBS versus FCS to try and fill out the time. So we should be able to reap the benefits here. I know you're excited to break down Florida State, but you know what? With so much ground to cover, there's no reason for us to banter back and forth. It's time to get to the meat of this show. It is finally time to introduce our prize recruit. We hit the transfer portal not quite as hard as Brian Kelly, Lane Kiffin, or even Lincoln Riley this offseason, but we brought in a crown jewel, a man who's going to take this podcast to the next level. You can follow Brad on Twitter. That's at BradPower7. And Brad, officially, you are now a member of the Bet the Board family, although you do have a chance to opt out. We just don't want any midseason transfers out of you.
You don't have to worry about the transfer portal with me, guys. I am fully committed. I appreciate that NIL money that you guys sent my way, but I got to tell you guys, I am beyond thrilled to be a part of this podcast. I've said this on Twitter. I think you guys have had the best deep dive college football podcast for years, and that includes when I was doing podcasts. So, I mean, I'm really, really happy to be joining you guys.
We have a long time this season to kind of get into some of the nuts and bolts if Payne wants to pull back the curtain of what that recruitment looked like, but so much ground to cover today. I do want to give you a chance, though, to introduce yourself to our loyal listenership. I know a lot of the college football diehards are familiar with all of the great content you've created across various platforms throughout the year, but in addition to obviously working with us this fall, there are a number of ways that people can get your information. What are some of the best avenues where they can find you through social media and some of the other channels?
So starting off, just follow me on Twitter at BradPower7. Now, I will say I can be sarcastic and I can go after some people on Twitter, so I just want to get that warning ahead of time. But I'll tell you what, though, I do keep it mainly college football driven, Brad. So you're not going to get too much off the beaten path there. So BradPower7 on Twitter. Also got a website, BradPowerSports.com.
Awesome. That'll be great intel, and encourage all you folks, if you aren't already, you're going to want to follow Brad. He'll share nuggets throughout the course of the week in addition to everything he'll provide here around the Bet the Board podcast. And Payne, you ready to break down some games, my friend? We can officially put all of that preview material that we've done over the last, feels like 63 months in the rearview mirror and find some winners?
it's good that the regular season's finally here.
All right, let's get into West Virginia and Pittsburgh to try and break this game down. When you're looking at the numbers on this one, we'll call Pittsburgh a 7.5-point favorite, more or less a market consensus. Total in the game sits at 51.5. First time in a decade we get the backyard brawl back on the schedule. These teams have played a number of times, over 104 meetings between them between 1895, 2011. When you look at Pitt, they lead the all-time series, but West Virginia has actually dominated going back to 1988. However, don't remind them of the 4-touchdown favorite game that they lost 13-9 to Pittsburgh that disrupted their opportunity to get to a potential national championship game. And the last time these teams did battle on the football field, you saw some college football greats out there in the likes of Geno Smith, Tavon Austin, Aaron Donald. Pitt, they enter this season coming off the program's first ever ACC title, first ever outright conference title, and third conference title of any kind. Finished the year 11-1, went 7-1 in the ACC. Meanwhile, West Virginia on the flip side, they're seeking their first 7-win season under head coach Neil Brown. His .486 win percentage is second worst among West Virginia coaches that have been in Morgantown for more than 30 games. And Brad, before we get into the actual on-field matchup with these teams, wanted to get your take a little bit on the power numbers and how you've adjusted, maybe Pittsburgh even more so than West Virginia, as they try and figure out what life will look like without Kenny Pickett under center and Jordan Addison in the receiving corps.
So, yeah, Pittsburgh's an interesting team to evaluate this year. On one hand, I mean, you want to look at the most important position on a team, obviously the quarterback. You lose a rare first-rounder at the position coming out of Pittsburgh and Kenny Pickett. You lose the Blitnikoff Award winner at wide receiver and Jordan Addison. So, obviously a downgrade in that regard. But I think at a couple other positions, I think the market has downgraded Pittsburgh too much because I'm a line of scrimmage guy, and I like all 5 starters back on the offensive line for Pittsburgh. And defensively, I think their defensive line is legit top 10, maybe borderline top 5 unit nationally on that side of the ball. So my downgrade on Pittsburgh, at least compared to this spread on this game, wasn't as significant. I still think Pittsburgh, in my power ratings, clear-cut top 25 team, top 20 team, in fact. So my downgrade wasn't as significant as others.
And Payne, Brad mentions the number. We obviously saw some shops this offseason open this price tag as low as 5. It got to 7. There was some resistance, and it feels like there has been a buy point since then with the 7.5 more or less painted. There are some rogue 8s out there as well. When you look into some of the analytics for these two teams, what did some of your research and studying provide in terms of breaking this matchup down?
Yeah, I think when we did our research back in June with the ACC, the synopsis was that it'd be difficult to replace some of those guys Brad mentioned in Kenny Pickett and Jordan Addison, who apparently is not liking life on the West Coast right now. But, Addison had a 25% target share, and then you even lose Mark Whipple, who's a pass-happy OC, and I just think the offense is going to undergo a dramatic change here because you're looking at a unit that was 6th in EPA per pass among Power 5 teams. You look at the construction of this roster, and Brad mentioned the 5 returning starting offensive linemen. That was a group that finished 19th in adjusted line yards. The running back room is really deep with Abanikanda. He's got the potential to be pretty dynamic there. And you pair those things with the new OC, Frank Cignetti, and you have this educated idea that Pittsburgh's offense is going to operate substantially different. Cignetti was at Boston College last year, and I know Phil Yurkovich only played 6 games, many of them less than 100%, so this is a bit skewed. Then you had Dennis Grosel, who couldn't hit water if he fell out of a boat, but on standard downs alone, Boston College last season called runs at a 73% rate. It was the 6th highest in the country. All downs, BC ran at 60% of the time. So when you look at Cignetti and his background, Dave Wanstead disciple, the guy who put Ricky Williams in touch with marijuana, basically, because he ran him into the ground so much, So that's kind of the offense that I'm thinking we're going to see here. Certainly there's some weapons, right? Jared Wayne's nice. Gavin Bartholomew's good. You get the Akron transfer in Mumfield. But this is just a brand new quarterback in Keaton Slovis, completely different system. It's going to be a pro-style run-first team, and ultimately that's the one thing that may hinder my ability here. Pittsburgh's clearly the side. We've seen it go through the 7. My number is shockingly 11.5. You just wonder if this new scheme, this new style, where Narduzzi loves playing these one-score games. He gets back into that vibe. It makes me a little bit nervous there in terms of laying it at this point over a touchdown, even though my number is, substantially higher here. And I think when you look at something like this, right, the total was a little more interesting to me. It opened 55.5, came down to 54. Got all the way down to 50.5. We saw it move back to 52 yesterday, and then it came down again. Just all key numbers going on here with the total. It's just an interesting thing from that perspective. I'm not sure what we're going to see from Pittsburgh's offense that necessarily says, hey, we're gonna score a ton of points here. We care about covering spreads. That's my only fear here now at over a touchdown, even though our number's a little bit higher.
Well, you mentioned Narduzzi and Cignetti. I mean, I think it'll be music to Pat's ears, given the war of words we saw this offseason with Mark Whipple. He may want to try and run the ball 95% of the time and treat it like an option offense if he gets his wish. Well, you guys both kind of mentioned quarterback play here, and I think it's fascinating when you try and figure out what two USC transfers can look like. JT Daniels, his third stop to lead this West Virginia offense, had a truncated camp, wasn't able to work with the offense. You'd imagine that group operates in fits and spurts. All the buzz is that Keaton Slovis has popped back in his ball. The velocity was there when he went to the Manning camp. Brad, when you look at JT Daniels, we know Payne is the torchbearer for the Stetson Bennett fan club, so he was thrilled that JT never got a shot down there in Athens. How do you expect him to lead Neil Brown's offense when you consider how big a disappointment it's really been watching the Mountaineers over the last couple seasons as it pertains to quarterback
obviously
play?
There's some familiarity there with, Harrell coming over being the new OC who recruited, JT Daniels, and he ran that offense back at USC. But with that being said, I don't like JT Daniels. I don't. I don't like the arm strength. And there's really nothing on film that's ever, given me positive vibes, decision making. The fact that he couldn't beat out Stetson Bennett after a couple of years, I think pretty much says all it needs to be said about JT Daniels. So I know a lot of people in West Virginia are thinking clear upgrade. Yeah, sure. I think he's a little bit of an upgrade over what they had, last couple of years with Deggy at quarterback. But I don't think it's a significant upgrade. It's another reason why, my numbers agree with Payne, and I'm over 10 points here as far as a pure power rating.
It's amazing that West Virginia fans think it'll be an upgrade. You can understand why when Jarrett Dagey can't even win the starting job at Western Kentucky. I think he's entered the transfer portal for the 37th time, but no doubt an iconic matchup that I think everyone in college football is excited to see back on the schedule to kick things off. And the final question I have for you, Brad, on this particular game, I know you come things with a very different perspective than Payne and I, and it's a big part of why we wanted to include you in the fold. Is this a game where you've taken a position at some of the previous numbers? I mean, I'm judging by the dialogue between you guys. Suffice to say, both of you have made a compelling case for Pittsburgh, but obviously at prices that probably no longer exist.
Yeah, so I don't have that, significant, bankroll that Payne has with the, the condos in 3 different states and whatnot.
Very few do, Brad. Very few do. So you and I, we can share a common affliction on this show going forward.
I'm okay taking some early numbers at some lower limits. So I'm probably a little bit overexposed and probably got a little too much more than I'm comfortable with on Pitt, but I laid 5, laid 6, laid 7. Also took a little bit of a piece of the under 54. At the current numbers, though, I agree with Payne. I am not super confident at laying anything more than 7 points with Pittsburgh, just because maybe a non-need. I mean, first off, Narduzzi is not a guy that I typically want to lay points with, period. But I'm not sure how aggressive they're going to be as far as really wanting to cover this spread and getting margin.
Should be a great game to watch, no doubt, as we remind all of you, our loyal listeners, if you're late to the game and it's the first time you're breaking down some of the marquee matchups. If you missed the number, it is a marathon, not a sprint, so don't lay the worst of it. From the backyard brawl.
Todd, I don't want to go backwards.
Oh, here we go.
Brad mentioned one thing that was really interesting to me that we probably should elaborate on just a little bit more, specific to the total, right? We think Keaton Slovis is a little bit better than the market may think he is, but again, you talk about that familiarity. It's just not on the other end, right? Graham Harrell was his offensive coordinator. He knows everything about Keaton Slovis, what he likes to eat, what he can't do on a football field, his tendencies. And I think that was partly the handicap and why we saw this total come down a little bit.
I thought you were going to take umbrage with Brad saying you only had 3 condos instead of 7 across multiple continents. But football related, we can definitely go back to be able to
Good to see the Brad is comfortable, which I love. But now I'm going to get double teamed.
Hey, you know what? Elite talents get double teamed, and that's what separates college all-stars from guys that can make the jump to the National Football League. So I'm sure you'll be able to handle it and control yourself throughout the course of the season. For the Backyard Brawl, gentlemen, to a Big Ten showdown to kick things off, a game you'll be able to see on Fox between Penn State and Purdue. You're looking at the Penn State Nittany Lions, a 3.5-point favorite across the board. Total in the game, 53.5. The total, depending on where you look this offseason, did open as high as 58.5 in some shops. The side, though, has held pretty steady, which is rare for week one. These two programs were two of the worst rushing offenses in the country last year, both outside the top 115. When you look at the Nittany Lions, they have beaten Purdue 9 straight, dating back to 2005, winning the last 4 meetings by 20-plus points. The last meeting between these programs came back in 2019, and Penn State rolled through the Boilermakers to the tune of 35-7 in a game where they won the rushing battle 460-104. And I know a lot of people are going, well, that's ancient history, but Keshawn Clifford's in his 17th year of eligibility. He was actually the starter for Penn State back in that matchup, and Clifford went 20 of 29 for nearly 300 yards passing and accounted for 4 touchdowns. When you look at the Boilers, their last win in the series came way back in 2004 with Purdue great Kyle Orton at the helm, a name I didn't think we'd mention at all in 2022 on the Bet the Board podcast. Brad, when you look at these two teams, we know Penn State has to replace a ton of talent on the defensive side, but this is also a Boilers program that loses George Karlaftis, a first-round NFL draft pick to the Kansas City Chiefs. They're a little bit thinned out at receiver, but one of the bigger losses that I don't think casual fans will know enough about is losing defensive coordinator Brad Lambert to Wake Forest. How have you gone about adjusting some of the expectations numerically for these two teams?
Yeah, so for starters, pure power rating to the decimal point, Penn State 3.3. So market is relatively in line with my numbers there. You mentioned Purdue. I thought we got a good preview of this Purdue team in the bowl game. I mean, without their 2 best players for last season, David Bell at wide receiver, Karlaftis on defensive line, somehow, some way. Everyone, including myself, was betting Tennessee and fading Purdue without their 2 best players. They go and win that game outright. So that gave me probably a little bit more of an optimistic look on Purdue's chances to continue the momentum that they had last year. I mean, that was arguably their best season since Kyle Orton was their quarterback almost 2 decades ago, a season ago. You mentioned the defensive coordinator. Man, I got to tell you, Brom has had some trouble keeping some defensive coordinators at Purdue. He runs through them as much as Payne does girlfriends, particularly in the offseason. So, I mean, it is a question mark for me. But I think the bigger question mark is James Franklin. I know he got a lot of respect for what he did at Vanderbilt, and deservedly so. But particularly the last 2 years, has anyone done less with more than James Franklin? I mean, we're talking a guy that is 500 his last 2 seasons, and they just had 8 guys drafted in the NFL draft. 8 guys to go 500 the last 2 years. They've signed a great recruiting class. I'll give them that. I'm not sure how much of an impact these guys are going to have on a season opener as a true freshman. So for me, I'm looking more towards the Purdue side here.
Yeah, you know what, Brad? It's pretty wild. You mentioned the 500 record for Penn. You mentioned the 500 record for Penn State over the last 2 seasons. This was a program that was 42-11 the 4 years before, and the lasting images college football fans have are of the whiteouts, the improbable wins or competitive games against Ohio State. But Payne, I feel like we've beaten you down a good amount. I guess I should give you the opportunity to defend yourself here.
I must have not been on the inside here, because I did not expect this happening. I thought I was bringing on Brad. We would be teaming up on you, and it's gone completely awry to start. So I checked my chat archive here, Todd, and I sent you a note on August 11th that I said Purdue plus 3.5 is going to come in at some point. And the hooks finally disappeared this past Tuesday. And once it got down to 3, it felt like a rush. Someone wanted to grab Penn State, and that's kind of where we're at. This game to me is bizarre because there are this many differing opinions among a lot of sharp bettors, and we're sitting around this key number of 3, and it's just kind of toggled back and forth based upon these differing opinions. And Brad did make a very good point there with the Tennessee bowl game, but it's difficult for me to gauge what Purdue is. Schematically, I like the idea of Jeff Brom's offense. And metrically, I love that Purdue's pass rate over expectation was the 5th highest in college football last year. And they were efficient throwing it, 25th in schedule-adjusted EPA per pass. But you look at Aiden O'Connell, and I go back to the spring game, started 0 for 6 on his first 6 attempts in that spring game, and there was 8 defensive backs out for Purdue there. He's super accurate. That's at least what we saw last year, right? Never finished a game completing less than 74% of his passes in games he started, and it was really impressive when you put it in the context of averaging 8.6 yards per pass attempt. My reluctance, though, is David Bell gone, top 100 pick. Jackson Anthrop graduated. Milton Wright, Purdue's #1 receiver, academically ineligible. That was 59% of the receptions last season. You're breaking in a new receiver coach to boot. Brock Thompson, the guy who crushed it in that Tennessee game, shredded, both of his knees. He had surgery on them. If you listen to this, kind of what Braum has been saying there, he didn't play in the final scrimmage on August 20th. He's hinted at Thompson playing against Penn State that he wants his snaps to go towards meaningful reps. It doesn't sound like that's a guy that's going to be getting all the reps in this game. And there's just so much turnover with Purdue's pass catchers. It makes me nervous in game 1 that a team that passed, 15% more than an average college team doesn't have some of these weapons or doesn't have them at full strength. And Purdue doesn't have an off-speed pitch, right? They're fastball. Bottom 5 in the country in EPA per rush last season. I know they think they've upgraded the run game here. They bring in a CMU transfer. Maybe that helps, and you can't be any worse than 124th in adjusted line yards. But I just don't see it here, right? And you couple that with a Penn State defense that finished 8th in schedule adjusted EPA per pass allowed. James Franklin, who I also don't really think is that great, does believe in his secondary, and that's the strength of the unit. He thinks the back 8 there, that he can rotate 8 guys. The last thing that I feel is, pretty important, and I know we kind of got there directionally with Sean Clifford. The thing that makes me interested in Penn State, and not necessarily in this game, but thinking they're a little bit better than market, is you have Mike Yurcich, who I think is a really good OC. It's going to be his second year. You have a 6th-year senior operating it. If you look at Penn State's offense heading into the Iowa game last year, where Sean Clifford was playing really efficiently and was 100% healthy, Penn State was top 20 in EPA per pass, top 30 in early downs, top 30 in bypassing third downs and early downs. Then you look at Sean Clifford in the start of that game at Kinnick Stadium, went up and down the field, marched Penn State early, 17 points the first 17 minutes of that game, goes down with an injury. The offense never recovered at that point. So I just don't know what Purdue is. You mentioned, losing Brad Lambert as well. I think that's a big deal, right? You look at that defense for Purdue last year, and I get that they're probably better than the sum of its parts, but 88th, 82nd, 60th were the first 3 seasons Jeff Brom's defense finished in defensive efficiency. 25th last year. Like, Brad Lambert was there. Now he's not. I don't know what Purdue is. One of the toughest teams for me to gauge. I almost feel like I would have rather laid 3 than take 3.5. That's just kind of my vibe on this game, but haven't done anything with it personally.
Brad mentioned the fact that Purdue has found a lot of instability at defensive coordinator. The same can be said about what Penn State has done on the offensive side. You mentioned the continuity that they'll at least get for a second season. We'll see if Sean Clifford, being the veteran quarterback he is able to continue to build on some of that hot start that we saw early last year. But also want to further substantiate your point, talking about some of Purdue's struggles running the ball. Quite frankly, they just don't do it. I mean, this is a team, if we go back to 2019, that throws it almost 44 times a game, a rate that's second in the FBS, and they only run it about 28.5 times a contest over the last couple of seasons. That's the 4th fewest. So it puts in perspective, if Purdue's passing game isn't working, they don't have a secondary pitch that they can go to. Last but not least on this game, Brad, if I'm looking at Penn State from an offensive and defensive side, Purdue offensively or defensively, is there a unit that you feel most comfortable in versus the unit that you have the most questions about going into the season?
Even though they have a new defensive coordinator, and I'm intrigued to see what Penn State looks defensively under Manny Diaz, I just, historically speaking, I trust the Penn State defense right now more than any of the other units. And I mean, it was a big reason why, I was looking more towards under first gut instinct, and listening to Payne, maybe I poke fun at his personal life and whatnot, but what I do respect is how he breaks down a game, and just listening to that, I am much more adept on thinking that my under position is better than my Purdue position.
And hey, look, this is a Penn State defense that was top 10 in points per game and yards per play allowed last season. The run defense did sag a little bit without P.J. Mustipher in the mix. He went out against Iowa. They were number 1 in red zone defense in the league, 3rd in the nation behind Georgia and Clemson. So you can understand Brad's optimism about the continuity that the Nittany Lions have shown on the defensive side. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can also follow Payne there at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me on Twitter as well. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And gentlemen, from the Thursday tandem of games that we broke down to a Saturday slate chock full of matchups set to shake up the national landscape, we can kick things off as we always do in rotational order, not chronologically speaking here, with BI 165 and 166. The Utah Utes on the road in Gainesville taking on the Florida Gators. And this number painted 3 across the board. Total in this contest sits at 51. It's down a touch from where it was available about 7 to 10 days ago. And this will be the second ever meeting in program history. Teams played back in 1977. There is one common unifying thread between these programs, that of course being Urban Meyer, who finds himself top 10 in wins at both programs, having gone 22-2 at Utah and 65-15 while he was at Florida. These two teams also very familiar with starting the season quickly, albeit a little step up in class. Utah not playing FCS in-state programs and Florida beating up on the Sisters of the Poor. But the Utes have won 13 out of 14 season openers. Florida has been victorious 31 of 32. The Gators' schedule will do them no favors. After they play Utah, they'll get games against Kentucky, USF, and Tennessee. The only other time Florida faced a ranked opponent week 1 since the year 2000 was actually back in 2017 against Michigan. That game did not end all that well. But Brad, talking about Florida, we know Utah has continuity, not just at the quarterback position, but also amongst the coaching ranks. A change in regime in Gainesville this year. In steps Billy Napier, who elevated the program at Lafayette, but this is big boy football, and there are some pretty high expectations for where he can get this program in a not so short window of time.
So first off, number for me, pure power rating, Utah in the 3.5 range. So obviously off a key number there, it says, I'm more towards the Utah side of things. Market, though, I think it's going to stay 3 if I had to project further. But when it comes to, Florida, I really like the Billy Napier hire. I think, and we're starting to see it already, I'm a big recruiting guy. I think one of the major reasons why Dan Mullen was let go wasn't that he was wearing Darth Vader costumes to press conferences. I think it was the lack of big boy recruiting that he was, going up against Georgia. It wasn't faring so well. I mean, we've seen some early, really good returns in the recruiting class that the Napier's already putting together. With that being said, film-wise, watching the spring game, you could see the lack of recruiting that Mullen had done, because I thought at several positions, overall talent, especially depth, once you got to that second unit, just wasn't there. And you could Billy Napier, you could kind of feel that when they were talking with him on the sidelines of that game. The best piece of some info that I got on this game, I actually talked with the Utah play-by-play guy on a radio show for about an hour last week, and I really grilled him because I hear nothing but positive about Utah this year. You mentioned the continuity. Obviously, quarterback, head coach, OC, DC. That's very rare these days in college football to return all those guys. He mentioned, and thankfully he was very candid, special teams being a possible issue for Utah. And that's somewhat surprising when watching a Whittingham team over the last 10 years. Usually they got the kicker punter down. I mean, we're talking top 5 type unit in the country consistently. But there's question marks there. There's question marks in the return game without Britton Covey, who also played slot receiver for him for what felt like the last decade. So there's some concerns there. Linebacker, they actually think is going to be okay, even without arguably their best defensive player. Whittingham said best defensive player he's ever coached. Devin Lloyd's off to the NFL draft. They welcome a Florida transfer in Diabate. They got a couple of young kids that look to step in, so linebackers maybe not a big of a concern. They like their wide receivers. I don't nationally compared to some of the other elite programs, but they seem to be okay there. Tight end position, great 1-2 punch, Keithy and Kincaid. In fact, they're going to probably play Keithy a little bit at wide receiver just so they can get both guys on the field. Generally speaking, he thought, he's been covering the team for 15 years. And he thought that this is the most positive they've felt heading into a season. Now, with that being said, you guys know sometimes I can be a trend guy. And the reason I'm not, there as far as, really continuing to race to a window to bet Utah is system-wise. I looked it up. How does the SEC do in season openers against Power 5 teams? Because my thinking is I've seen the SEC, perform quite well and backed it up. Last 10 years, 64% against the spread. Talking a sample size of 42 games. SEC against Power 5 teams in their season opener usually perform well.
Brad, that may be music to Payne's ears because he loves to call the West Coast soft, although Utah kind of breaks the mold in terms of what they bring from a level of physicality. You mentioned the offense, 8 starters return. Cam Rising was outstanding. Took over for Charlie Brewer after Utah started the campaign 1-2. Didn't put up gaudy numbers, but in a Kyle Whittingham offensive sort, you're not really asked to do that. You highlighted the tight ends. Payne, I know when we broke down Utah, we did have a best bet as it related to the Utes win total. That neither being here nor there. When you look at Utah's full body of work for the way they finished last season and some of the expectations coming in, what do the analytics tell you we might be able to expect from the Utes trying to maintain their status amongst that mountaintop and maybe even be a dark horse for the college football playoff?
Yeah, we did give out over 8.5 on the Pac-12 preview, and I think we really intimated that this would be a move that we would see as well, going from pick out to 3. And we all have our power ratings, and most of us have data, and we're able to make some manual adjustments because I think that's really important. And I kind of banged the drum that you needed to make a manual adjustment for Utah last season, and if you do that, they look even better. And that's simply factoring for Cam Rising. Didn't start until week 4. Once he did, Utah was a fringe top 5 offense in schedule adjusted efficiency. So I thought you had to really significantly downweight the first 3 games of last season. Looking at this matchup, I think Utah should be able to run the ball right at Florida, right up the middle. And even you go back to last year, the offensive line started a little bit shaky, but they came on strong. Utah finished top 20 adjusted line yards, opportunity rate, power success rate. The one thing Kyle Whittingham said in his presser recently is he made sure that he had his starting 5 in place earlier this offseason to build some chemistry and make sure they could keep the group healthy throughout camp. Tavion Thomas, solid as they come, finished with a 3.8 yards per rush after contact, breaks a ton of tackles. Also at his size has the burst, led the Pac-12 in explosive runs. If you look at Florida on the interior, past Gervin Dexter, lots of questions up the middle, and what I'm hearing is the one sure thing Florida had up the middle in Gervon Dexter, he's moving to the end position in 3 down front. So it's going to be Jalen Lee's going to start at nose tackle. You have Princely, who'll be the other guy out there in 3 down fronts. I think there's question marks about the talent and the depth on the interior of Florida's D-line, and you could tell that was a position of need because they went out and tried hitting guys in the portal, and unfortunately, the Gators just struck out multiple times adding nose tackle or interior linemen. It just didn't happen. Utah, to me, is very much a run to set up the pass offense. I think we're still projecting, though, the Utes to finish top 10 in EPA per rush again. And here's the interesting part is Brad mentioned the loss of Britton Covey. Cam Rising came out and said he believes the receiver group is way ahead of where it was this time last season. You have 5 of the top 6 pass catchers back. Keithy and Kincaid, that's just an elite tight end tandem. Both average more than 2.1 yards per route run. If you look at the projected starting linebackers for Florida, you have Ventrell Miller. He's given up a 74% completion rate the last 2 seasons in coverage. Amari Burney, slated to start. He's given up an 82% completion rate. Last season alone, he gave up a 139 passer rating when targeted. So I think there's a real advantage there for Utah's tight ends. There was also this interesting quote from Kyle Whittingham recently as well. He said, receivers need to be more involved to take another step forward with the offense. Cam Rising's been making throws he wasn't necessarily able to make in 2021. There's a nice mix of receivers here. And so I think Brad's kind of hinted at this, not at the national level is this unit getting respect, but internally they think from top to bottom, it's one of the best they've ever had. Devon Vele looks like a solid deep threat. Even the young guys, Money Parks and Makai Cope, have been just surging all camp and summer. We saw Makai Cope make this ridiculous one-handed grab in the spring game. It was pouring rain, and Money Parks has been like the rave of camp. So I think this receiver group's a little bit better than people think, Todd.
Payne, I want to double back to you in terms of the elements that Utah is going to encounter. Now, granted, this game won't be played with a noon kickoff in the heat of the day, but it is a little bit of unfamiliar territory for a team that trains in altitude and relatively dry weather, going to the heat and humidity that can play a role, especially as you get deeper into the game. Now, Utah obviously has a little bit more depth than Florida, but how do you go about trying to factor that into some of your handicapping in addition to the analytics? And then, Brad, I want to follow up with you on the Florida offense after we get Payne's answer.
Yeah, I think there was a quote that I read from Whittingham, and he said, "We know what we're up against, and we know that the weather is going to be a factor. We've done the necessary precautionary steps to get ready for that with humidity and working with wet balls. We're making sure we're ready." Because there was also a chance of rain in the forecast. Now, that looks like it's subsided a little bit, but at one point a week ago, there was about a 45% chance of rain. It sounds like Kyle Whittingham has prepared his team both for the humidity and the chance of rain.
Hey, it makes a ton of sense. We'll have a similar team hailing from the state of Utah. Not a game that we'll break down in depth. That'll have to deal with those elements as BYU travels to the Gulf Coast to take on USF in a matchup where you've seen a little bit of dog money come in. But Brad, as far as Florida's offense is concerned, you talked about how Dan Mullen had struggled a little bit on the recruiting trail that ultimately led to his demise and them electing to go in a different direction. I mean, the Gators lose their top 3 rushers, and for those of us that have followed preseason, it's amazing when you watch Dameon Pierce earn the starting job in Houston, a guy that never got the proper workload or the touches to try and show some of that explosive potential. The only player that remains of their top 3 receivers are Justin Shorter. When you look at the all SEC teams, the only player to make a preseason conference team is Osiris Torrance, who's actually a transfer from Lafayette, one of the crown jewels along the offensive line. And obviously, there are expectations that are getting sky high from Anthony Richardson. But at the same time, we know he's got oodles of talent. We just haven't seen a lot of that on full display. So when you're assessing the Florida offense, is this going to be a group that has to walk before it runs? Or how should we potentially go about looking to grade what Billy's going to bring right from the opening snap?
So I think it's more of a walk before a run situation. And look, I like Anthony Richardson and the talent level there. I mean, how can you not like a guy 6'5", but built very well in the limited time that he had, at least early on against questionable competition. South Florida being one of them. It looked really good. Competition stepped up. The stats and the production went down a little bit. So even though I love the talent level, he's still a question mark. And a bigger question mark is the overall talent surrounding him. They got a projected starting tight end that was playing defense last year on the defense side of the ball for Florida last year. I mean, it's the thing that you brought up says a lot, that a Louisiana transfer is going to be arguably their best offensive lineman. I thought the best running back in the spring game was also a Louisiana Lafayette transfer that comes over. So a lot more questions than answers on that side of the ball. Real quickly, I did grill the Utah guy on how they've been practicing indoor facility with humidity. Utah reminds me, and I hate to do this to you, Payne, reminds me how Boise State prepped for Florida State that season opener a few years ago. I bring that up because it was Boise State that wore down Florida State in the heat and humidity of Tallahassee.
Yep. I made a joke to Todd the other day thinking about Willie Taggart coaching at the likes of Oregon and Florida State. And we're going to look back in like 5 years and be like, how the hell did that actually happen? That guy, I don't know if I'd let him walk to the end of the driveway and fetch the mail.
You know what? Willie may have found a spot where he feels much more comfortable in Boca Raton. We'll see if FAU is able to compete for a Conference USA title. But I'm right there with you, echoing those same sentiments. A guy that never lived up to some of his potential at power programs. But from Utah,
one thing I want to mention about this game from the Gators' offensive perspective, and I think if Brad hit this perfectly in terms of the weaponry that's actually at Florida's disposal, and you think about the defense that Utah wants to run. It's press man coverage for Morgan Scalley, right? Clark Phillips has the chance to be one of the best corners in the country. He's the highest rated Utah recruit. He allowed less than half a yard per coverage snap the final 6 games. All of the guys that missed the Rose Bowl have returned to full health. You're coming off a game where you played C.J. Stroud in Ohio State, and now you go to this receiver core, and it's going to be interesting to see if those Florida receivers can create enough separation to where Florida can't, for Utah rather, where Utah's not just like cheating into the box and stopping the run. That's what's interesting. The other element here, if you followed this, Anthony Richardson obviously is extremely mobile. Jack Miller, quarterback 1B, had thumb surgery. He's going to miss some time. Third-string quarterback Jalen Kitna had a knee procedure. He's going to miss some time. So is Florida's offense going to be willing to run Anthony Richardson? God forbid he gets hurt. You're now on quarterback 4, and we know in high-leverage games like this, you want your mobile quarterback to be out there running typically more than usual. Is Billy Napier in game 1 going to allow that, knowing the drop-off is precipitous to quarterback 4? And I think that's something you do have to handicap, because if you don't use Anthony Richardson's legs as much in this spot, the offense probably needs to be taken a touch back in terms of your projections.
It will be interesting to see if you get any. Yeah, it will be interesting to see if you get any quarterback rushing props. But spoiler alert, Florida fans, to kind of concisely encapsulate what Payne said, you do not have any receivers on your roster that'll rival the skill set of Jackson, Smith, and Jigba out there to put this Utah defense on skates. Speaking of one of the more talented wide receivers in the country, we'll go from Gainesville to Columbus, where Notre Dame and Ohio State will do battle. This is a game that's been on the move all summer long, with Ohio State now a 17-point favorite as they'll welcome in the Fighting Irish. Total in this game sits at 59. Just the fourth time since 2000 these two teams will meet in the top 5. Just fourth time since 2000 two teams, in the top 5 will meet during week 0 or week 1, happening for the second straight season after Georgia and Clemson did it last year. This will be the first regular season meeting between these programs since 1996. They did, of course, meet in a bowl game much more recently than that. When you look at the Buckeyes, they've won 22 straight season openers. Marcus Freeman, he, of course, makes his regular season debut as boss of the Irish and does so with Tyler Buckner also making his first career start. I want to mix things up, guys. We've let Brad open on the first couple of games, but we know Brad lives and dies with the Golden Domers, although we know we'll get an honest assessment of where they are. So, Payne, here's your chance for rebuttal and to try and take shots for a Notre Dame team that may have to trot out Rudy at wide receiver to put this Ohio State defense on notice.
Hold on a second here, because I've been getting my balls busted all day. Did you say rebuttal?
Yeah, I want you to, go ahead.
The rebuttal would be someone else saying something that I disagreed with and then coming in, but you have me leading off.
Yeah, well, I want you to take shots at Brad, and then Brad can defend himself as a result, and we can go back and forth. So I apologize if I didn't use rebuttal in the proper context for you.
Hey, listen, I hear that you can get your school money back these days, is what I'm hearing.
I've already paid all that stuff off, so pipe down over there.
So I'm going to let Brad, give a little bit more of a breakdown on this game. But when I look at the Irish offense, it makes me a little nervous, right? This is one of those games where my power number in the on-field matchups don't quite align. And I don't know if the matchups are really good for Notre Dame in any spot. But even with Jim Knowles breaking in a new scheme, and it's really difficult to pick up. We know that. But anything you've read here, like coming out of Ohio State, is the defense has really improved. Guys are flying around. They feel confident. They're using a bunch of different looks. They don't seem overwhelmed. Knowles didn't coach in the bowl game, so he's been there 8 months already. If Ohio State can execute his system, this is the right kind of defense, I think, that you can confuse a young quarterback like Tyler Buckner. One thing that we... Go ahead. No, go ahead. I wanted to follow up with that, but go ahead. Yeah, if you look at Buckner last year, and again, the sample size is small, he struggled to process last season. And we know that Jim Knowles' defenses make you think as a quarterback. And if you look at the data, and again, it's a very small sample, if you chose not to blitz Tyler Buckner, you made him go through his progressions and throw from the pocket, he really struggled. And I think when you have a Jim Knowles type of defense who went against Spencer Sanders, a mobile quarterback, every single day, there is a little bit of a leg up in preparing for that. Then you look at Notre Dame, it's a beat up running back room. The receiver group has questions. This is just a really tall task, I think, for Tyler Buckner going into this environment with these kind of skill guys around him and expect them to perform extremely well. And I know the one thing we've heard all week, right? Marcus Freeman talking about being physical and wanting to run the ball. I understand if you look at Ohio State games last year and you see the ones they lost against Oregon and Michigan, of which, they both got bullied. You want to play keep away and have C.J. Stroud picking splinters out of his ass. But Ohio State finished 22nd in opponent-adjusted EPA per rush allowed. And I don't think Notre Dame's young offensive line is that elite, right? I think they're good. I think they're going to make some improvements, but this is, a team that was 65 in adjusted line yards, below 65th in opportunity rate, power success rate, and stuff rate allowed. There's also a real chance Jarrett Patterson, one of their best linemen, could miss this game. He played center last year, graded out the 15th best center in the country. You look at Notre Dame's lead back, he's 5'9", 195 pounds, and Chris Tyree. Is that really the guy that's going to be a bell cow in this spot? 4 yards a carry, one of the worst elusive ratings among qualifying Power 5 backs last season. I actually think Tyree's a better pass catcher, and Audric Estime should be the guy that we watch between the tackles. I think we're going to see more read option, more designed runs from Tyler Buckner, but this is just, again, a really, really tall task, because if Notre Dame can't run efficiently, I don't know what the second option is. And we're talking about a unit that finished outside the top 70 in EPA per rush last season. I don't think the run game upgrades that quickly. You're going to need Michael Mayer and Lorenzo Styles simultaneously to kind of be dominant and explosive. Avery Davis also went down on offense, but certainly intrigued to hear what Brad has to say about the Irish offense here.
Yeah, Brad, I'll open the floor up to you as far as what we can expect from Notre Dame's offense, and then we can comment a little bit on Jim Knowles. I know that Payne mentioned him obviously coming over from Oklahoma State, a lot of optimism for the Scarlet and Gray faithful, thinking that this is suddenly going to be a unit catapulted into the top 10, and I've even seen, prognosticators share that this could be a top 5 defense, but he hasn't necessarily realized the heights of what his expertise can get in some of his previous stops. But when you look at Notre Dame offensively, to Payne's point, there's no doubt a shortage of weapons, especially for week 1.
Yeah, so it's interesting that, obviously Notre Dame just played Oklahoma State in the bowl game. Knowles didn't coach the game, but obviously his scheme was in place, and, Notre Dame had success through the pass game against that Oklahoma State defense. Now, the talent level for Ohio State is significantly better, particularly on the defensive line, I think. And I think that's maybe one of the mispricings here. I think Ohio State's defensive line is going to be really, really good. I think people forget that JTT and Jack Sawyer were 1-2 as far as 5-star recruits on the defensive line last year. Now they're true sophomores, and I expect better production there. They still have Zach Harrison. So you mentioned the Notre Dame offensive line, which I think is going to end up being a good unit. I'm not sure that they're a good unit right now. I mean, Patterson flipped from center to left guard, so they can get the 5 best players on the line. Zeke Correll is going to play center. And now, Patterson, I would say more doubtful than questionable at left guard. I like Notre Dame's 2 tackles, Alton Fisher, but they're also true sophomores playing in an extremely hostile environment with a quarterback. But if you don't know the Buckner backstory, guy, played 1 year of high school football, set a ton of state records in the state of California, then tore up his knee, didn't play, then didn't play because of COVID, so there's 2 years, and didn't play much last year. So we're talking a guy that's mainly played 1 season of football the last 4 years, at least a full season. Question marks there. I think Ohio State's defense actually, even with all the struggles last year, and even with the first game of a new coordinator, and we've heard the word violent is the word I've heard a couple times out of Ohio State's fall camp on that defensive side. I think they have their way with Notre Dame.
Going to be interesting to watch that side of the ball, but if the Irish are going to be competitive, they're going to have to try and find a way to slow down Ohio State's high-powered offense that many have called arguably not the best in the country this year, but one that could flirt with all-time greatness, maybe even rivaling what we saw from Joe Burrow and company. So I guess, Brad, I'll come right back to you. I mean, is there any hope for Notre Dame's defense of slowing down this offensive onslaught from Ohio State, other than potentially with prayers answered by Touchdown Jesus?
Well, I do like Notre Dame's defensive line. So I think they can, have some success maybe slowing down Ohio State's run game. But I'm here to tell you, there's a significant mismatch on the outside. And normally when you see, it's a top 5 matchup, you don't see a talent disparity like you're going to see with Ohio State's wide receivers versus Notre Dame's defensive backs. I mean, I tweeted this out in the summer. Notre Dame's defensive backs are all 3 stars, and not even highly rated 3 stars. We're talking none of them. We're in the top 600 coming out of high school overall players. And then you compare that to Ohio State's wide receiver core, where it's 5-star, 5-star, 5-star. Oh yeah, and then Marvin Harrison Jr., who's only a top 100 recruit, high 4 stars, probably in my opinion going to be a top 10 wide receiver in college football this year. So I just don't see it on the outside. I think Ohio State's passing game will have their way and do whatever they want, regardless of whether or not they can have success in the run game against Notre Dame.
Payne, have you identified any weaknesses whatsoever with what Ohio State wants to do offensively, knowing that C.J. Stroud has another year in the system? Brad talked about some of their weapons, and everywhere you look, there's a player capable of getting the ball in his hands and taking it to the house from 20 yards, 50 yards, or even inside the shadow of their own end zone.
I think what's really interesting, and I do like Notre Dame's front seven maybe from a pressure perspective, but everyone seems to be bypassing the fact that Notre Dame was a little soft against the run last season, outside the top 60 in line yards, 42nd in opportunity rate. All told, when you adjust for opponent, 97th in EPA per rush allowed. Okay, and with C.J. Stroud in this receiver group, you're not going to be able to load the box. And then you have Trayvon Henderson and Mayan Williams, could be the best running back tandem in college football. Henderson turned 19% of his carries into 10-plus yard gains. Mayan Williams really hasn't had a chance. 81 total career carries. He's broken 40 tackles in those carries. The other thing that's interesting is, what we've seen from Al Golden's defenses in the past. He wants to play man coverage. He wants to blitz. I don't really know if you can do that against C.J. Stroud, right? He's in the 99th percentile in sack rate taken. When you look, Stroud has a 10% pressure to sack rate. If Al Golden elects to play this high variant style of blitzing C.J. Stroud, Brad hit it perfectly. I don't know if Notre Dame has the secondary to hold up in coverage. And I get it. You look at the metrics. Last year, Notre Dame was third in opponent adjusted EPA pass defense. And, many times the group does look like it's better than the sum of its parts. Past Cam Hart at corner, who is there? The safety duo is nice of DJ Brown, and then you have the Northwestern transfer, Brandon Joseph. But there's questions about coverage past those three guys. I think Ryan Day is going to put Notre Dame linebackers in conflict with some of those route trees and his tight ends. You look at J.D. Bertrand, starting middle linebacker. He has been a liability in coverage. So look for him to be picked on a little bit there. I just don't see many matchups that give Notre Dame a fighting chance here, and I think that's the reason, we've seen Ohio State take money all summer. We did see a small buyback when it reached 17.5, 18. I think the next move around that 3-score mark will be the most telling one, knowing, right, limits are the highest right now than they've been at any point leading up to this game. It would not stun me if we saw another tick back up on game day.
Before we put a bow on this game, gentlemen, I want to see if either of you had one other element or nuggets that you want to include. I obviously like to be as comprehensive as we can, figuring that this will be the most watched game on the entire Saturday
I got one.
slate.
A long-term trend for Notre Dame. Because obviously there's this narrative that Notre Dame does not perform well in big games. So I'll ask you guys this. Do you think Ohio State finishes in the top 10 this season? So
yes.
That's very bad news for Notre Dame. Last 30 years against teams that finish in the top 10, 5-44 straight up. Against the spread, I think this is more telling. 27% against the spread, 49 games against teams that finish in the top 10, failing to cover by 7 points per game. Mainly doesn't matter, the coaches changed, players changed, but the reality is, Notre Dame as a program does not step up in these types of moments against teams that can out-talent them.
I was going to say, Brad, that all can't be heaped on Brian Kelly's shoulder and explain why he had to leave for Baton Rouge, a game that we'll get to later in the show. But that's just wild when you talk about such a proud program and when they step up in class, how poorly they fare, not just from a straight-up standpoint, but more importantly at the betting window, since we know the point spread is the great equalizer. As we talked about, 2 big games still to go, Georgia-Oregon on the horizon, as well as Sunday showdown between Florida State and LSU. But want to take a slightly divergent path with a new segment we're going to try and introduce this year on the podcast, and we're still working the name a little bit, but gentlemen, I think we settled on non-Powers 5 or something like that. But if we have creative listeners, by all means make suggestions. We're always happy to incorporate. And Brad, wanted to get your take on a game that won't involve 2 Power 5 opponents doing battle this weekend that's really caught your eye.
So I've been picking on Payne here, and now it's my turn to get after you a little bit, Todd. For the non-Power 5 game, it features one group of 5 team, but the other team is actually a Power 5 team. Maybe not historically, but it's Boise State against Oregon State. And I'm here to tell you, I know you love Jonathan Smith. I love Jonathan Smith. I love the Beavers, but
You're gonna dash my dreams here of everything I've tried to build from a loyal fan base in Corvallis.
I am. I like Boise State in the matchup. Now, we've seen money come in on Boise State all summer. I'm a part of it. I think Boise State, after a season where, record-wise, worst season in 2 decades, I thought diving into them statistically, the Broncos were much better than that 7-5 record. And being as experienced as they are coming back, now second year under Andy Avalos, and the fact, as much as I love Jonathan Smith, hasn't done well in openers, hasn't covered an opener in his tenure there. Boise State, a game that I think is really intriguing. I think it's the best late game. Obviously it's a very late start, but it's one of the better games of the weekend. Keep an eye on this one. I think Boise State might be actually a play-on team, at least early in the season. I'm actually going to fade Todd Fuhrman's beloved Oregon State Beavers.
Hey, you know what? I can't really argue with you. There are some question marks at quarterback, especially for Oregon State. I don't think they have the playmakers on the outside early on in the years. They lost some experience at receiver or even in the backfield, which also might further substantiate why you're seeing dog and under take money, knowing how good Andy Avalos' defense is supposed to be. But I did want to ask, Brad, because Payne and I have been relatively critical of Avalos, at least in his one season. They're not sure what to expect. But when you look at him and Hank Bachmeier, do you feel like this is the year they're finally able to break through and achieve some of the lofty accolades that people were heaping on them, maybe a little bit prematurely?
That's the question, and it's probably the answer to that is going to be whether or not I win this bet. So, Bachmeier, going back, not to, put a needle into Payne, but, man, you go back to that opener, his first start, he took a beating against Florida State but kept coming back time and time again. Just has never really lived up to that opening game that he had several years ago. I want to think in a second year of a system and offensive line hopefully has him better protected. Now, I think half of it is Bachmeier just holds on to the ball too long and takes too many sacks. But I would like to think now in year 4 that he does have his best season. If he doesn't, then this is going to be a loser. If he doesn't, I think Boise State's a team. If we're looking at teams, outside of the AAC to make some noise and actually run for a major bowl berth, I think Boise State's the choice this year.
That's awfully interesting. A team who, to your point, Brad, lived up to all the defensive hype a season ago. It was just the offensive inconsistency that held them back. Payne, wasn't sure if you had a note or wanted to share anything on that particular game before we move on to a couple of blue bloods that'll do battle in Atlanta.
Well, you mentioned the total, and I don't really love talking about totals previously bet, especially when they've moved off key numbers, and 58 is one of those relevant numbers in college football. But I kind of agree with where your sentiments are, right? Quarterback question marks, weapon question marks for the Beavers. They also, I think, take a step back with their offensive line. That was like all world last year. They only have 3 returning starters there. Defensively, the Beavers do a nice job limiting some explosives. And then Boise State's defense, to me, projection-wise, could be the best since the Chris Peterson days. So, again, agree with Brad that this is like the premier late game Saturday night, and maybe because of that you do have a chance for this to get back to 58 and nibble a little bit on the under.
Let it be known, gentlemen, this will be the last time that we slander the Beavers unless they start the season 0-6 against the spread. Then they open themselves up to ridicule, and it becomes fair game. But no doubt a great way to close things out, a kickoff that you can see at 10:30 Eastern time. Long before we get there, though, we'll see the defending national champions put their long winning streak on display as 17-point favorites against the Oregon Ducks. I know technically this game is being played on a neutral field in Atlanta, but let's not sugarcoat it. There'll be about 85%, if not closer to 90%, of fans in attendance wearing black and red more so than green and gold. The only previous meeting between these programs came way back in 1977. When you look at Georgia, they've now won 7 straight season openers by at least a touchdown, and that includes 3 against ranked teams during that span. Meanwhile, Oregon, they've opened with a ranked team 3 times since 2009, and go figure, the Ducks have lost all 3 of those contests. The last time they opened with a ranked team was against Auburn's Bo Nix. Bring it all back together, and lost that game on one of the final offensive snaps with about 9 ticks to go. And Payne, if memory serves me correct, that was actually a best bet that we had on Auburn in that particular contest for this very podcast.
Very lucky.
Brad, when you look at Georgia, we've seen the stories. We know how much this team lost to the National Football League in terms of unprecedented status on that defensive side, the historical levels that they performed at week in, week out last year. How much have you downgraded Georgia from their national championship season, knowing the cupboard is far from from Bear, but you do lose a surplus of difference.
So
makers.
6 points in my power ratings, favoring Georgia's last year's team by about 6. I think some are probably surprised it's not more. Considering Georgia had 15 guys drafted, more than any other team in the history of at least a 7-round current NFL draft. But obviously, Kirby's done an excellent job of recruiting, as well as anybody not named Ohio State or Alabama. I'm here to tell you there's still a lot of talent on that roster, particularly at tight end. I mean, Brock Bowers, Gilbert. I even like the freshman Delp, Washington. I think it's arguably, if they're all healthy and ready to go, I think it's the deepest and most talented tight end position group, not only in the country this year, but maybe even in the history of college football. So it starts there offensively. I think the offensive line is still fine. I'm not too concerned about running back, although they've had some injury issues. Stetson Bennett is who he is at this point. I know they're going to put a little bit more on his shoulders this year and probably rely a little bit more on the offense to carry the team a little bit. But with that being said, I know they lose a ton on defense, but Jalen Carter on the defensive line is as good as any defensive lineman in all of college football. There's some guys, when they're really breaking down the Georgia tape last year, that thought he might have been the best defensive lineman on last year's Georgia team. I also love the outside linebacker, Nolan Smith. He was the number 1 player coming out of high school. He's had an up and down career, but man, when he flashes, he flashes. So Georgia, 6-point downgrade, significant, but maybe not as much as what other people are making it to be.
Yeah, Payne, we know that Georgia, like Brad talked about, got all the headlines for what they brought to the table defensively. They won for a lot of folks in spite of an offense that really didn't show big play potential week in, week out. But Stetson Bennett played his 2 best games of the season when they needed it most. He was dynamic throwing the football downfield against Michigan, followed it up, making some big-time throws against Alabama. And when you look at Bennett's numbers, this is a quarterback that's still 14-3 as a Bulldog starter over the last 2 seasons. Completion percentage north of 64, a shade under 3,000 passing yards. I guess one of the questions where I'm going with this as far as the offense, do you think Todd Monken is going to be more aggressive knowing he's got a veteran quarterback, especially against a head coach in Lanning who knows about Georgia's personnel? These groups are intimately familiar with one another. This feels like one of the more fascinating matchups, not just in this football game itself, but maybe in the entire weekend of seeing cat and mouse.
Yeah, there is this cat and mouse element to it, obviously. And listen, when you're playing Georgia, and this is far easier said than done, but the teams that have played Georgia the last 2 seasons and either won or kept it close have put the Bulldog quarterbacks in negative game scripts. Now, it rarely happens, and the last time it did happen, right, was the national championship against Alabama, and Stetson Bennett played his way through it. But there's 2 ways to put Georgia in a neutral or negative game script. The first way is obviously through your offense and building a lead. The second way is being able to stop the run a little bit. And so that's an interesting element here. I know, if you look at Stetson Bennett's numbers last year, he wasn't put into many known passing situations. And that's why Georgia's offense was number 1 in EPA per pass and had a 26% explosive pass rate. It's because Stetson Bennett was always comfortable. But again, going back to the last 2 seasons where they have struggled either covering a spread or losing the game, it's 2020 against Alabama. Georgia trailed by double digits in the 3rd quarter, and Stetson Bennett was forced to throw, and he completed 45% of his passes, had 3 picks, finished with a negative EPA. 2020 against Florida, the Gators built a double-digit halftime lead. Offense got out. Bennett and Mathis completed 31% of their passes. That game had a negative EPA. Cincinnati kept it within 3 in the Peach Bowl. They built the lead and then held the Georgia running backs to less than 3.5 yards per carry. And then again in 2021, you had the season opener against Clemson and then the SEC championship game against Bama. Clemson held Georgia running backs to 4.6 a carry. In the SEC championship game, Bama built the lead, held Georgia running backs to 4.2 a carry. So that's kind of the formula, but can you do it, right? Build a lead or stuff the run. Dan Lanning went against Todd Monken's offense every day at practice. He sat in those meetings with Kirby discussing every weakness and tendency Stetson Bennett has. Interestingly, if you divide last season's Georgia's offensive line, they were better as pass blockers than run blockers. Georgia's O-line as run blockers had a 19% error rate. They finished 39th in adjusted line yards, 77th in power success rate, 54th in stuff run rate allowed. And that's why they were outside the top 70 in EPA per rush. Now, I know Oregon was completely bullied in the 2 games against Utah last season. They finished outside the top 80 in line yards themselves. But everything we're hearing out of the Ducks camp is that the front 7 is solid. It's going to surprise a lot of people. The unit is substantially healthier heading into the season than how it finished last year. The other area to, I think, look for on this side of the ball, and it would make me nervous, and I think Brad hit it perfectly, is Georgia's tight ends against the Oregon linebackers. And I think we mentioned this in our Pac-12 preview when covering the Ducks, but Noah Sewell's 6'2", 260 pounds. He's best as a downhill run defender and a pass rusher. He graded out well below average in coverage. Justin Flo is supremely talented. He can move pretty well, but the small sample we have on him due to injuries is he's got 43 coverage snaps. He's allowed an 86% reception rate for 11.3 yards per catch and a 147 passer rating in those coverage snaps. And the Dogs tight ends are just going to come at you in waves. They go 4 deep now. Oscar Delp is surging, and he adds to that group with, Brock Bowers, Darnell Washington, and Eric Gilbert. So that'll be the area where I think Georgia potentially has an advantage, is using their tight ends, putting multiple on the field at once and attacking those Duck linebackers in the pass game.
Oregon is going to have to do something to try and get Stetson Bennett off his spot, so we'll see if their defensive line, who you mentioned, has been getting rave reviews, but we know things are a little bit differently in the work a little differently in the Pac-12 than they do in the SEC. But Coach Lanning will have to scheme up unique ways to get pressure, not allowing Bennett to operate from a clean pocket and utilize that extremely talented tight end room that is hands down the best in the country with the variety of skill sets they bring to the table. Brad, when you look at this Oregon offense, we know that they bring in Bo Nix from Auburn, so he's familiar, having played Georgia multiple times during his career, reunited with offensive coordinator Kenny Dillingham as well. When you look at Nix's numbers overall, 21-13 as a starter, over 7,000 passing yards, less than 7 yards per attempt. Did improve his decision-making a little bit, but overall 39 touchdown passes to 16 interceptions. The big talk throughout the spring, and we saw some of it on full display during that spring game, was trying to identify those explosive plays, something that was inconspicuous in Oregon's offense. They just weren't able to connect on it last year. When you look at this Oregon offense, questions abound about their running back depth, their wide receiver depth. Do you feel they're going to be able to find some level of success attacking this Georgia defense?
I have some doubts, to say the least. But I came away liking what I saw from Oregon, at least in their spring game. Now, Oregon's defense is a little bit different than Georgia's defense, what they'll face. But Bo Nix right out of the gate, throwing down the field. And they got some talented wide receivers. One thing that you can question the X's and O's of Mario Cristobal, but he did do a good job of recruiting. They have a lot of experience on the offensive line, so that should help them hold up. I did find it a little bit maybe disconcerting that, for all the great recruiting classes that Mario Cristobal has, they're relying on a lot of transfers. Starting with Nix, I actually thought maybe the best wide receiver in the spring game was Chase Cota. I thought an afterthought pretty much at UCLA, but he was flashing left and right in the spring game. So maybe the talent level wasn't as good as what the recruiting classes were coming out of high school, or just maybe with the new system, new head coach, didn't necessarily, the players that were currently on the roster didn't necessarily fit what he wanted to do. So I think they can be okay enough to maybe cover the point spread, but man, am I, racing the window to bet an Oregon team total offensively in this game? No, I'm not.
I'll open this up to you guys before we wrap this contest up. We talk about inefficiency in the betting market, specifically with college football early on in the season. This number, both side and total, really hasn't moved much from where it opened. Yes, there were some 16.5s out there. It's moved through a secondary key out to 17.5 in some shops. The total largely 51 or 52.5 up to 53, 52.5. Which does the market mesh with the way that you guys assess it? And Payne, I can start with you, and Brad, if you want to jump right in after, feel free to piggyback.
I don't really want anything to do with this game. It's not even one I'm considering, candidly. And I think, it's somewhat interesting thinking about the total, because I'm not quite sure what Oregon's offense is. I'm not really quite sure what Georgia's defense is. And that's ultimately what's kept me off this total. But it does feel like it's a sneaky under. But to Brad's point, he hit it perfectly. Like, Kenny Dillingham wants to open this offense up. He wants it to be more vertical. And even though Georgia does recruit at these all-world levels, it's very difficult to lose 8 defensive starters that got drafted from a historic unit that literally gave up 0.36 non-garbage time points per drive through 11 games. And so I think you see Georgia's defense take a slight tick back. Oregon's offense probably takes a tick up, and it's certainly going to be a little bit more aggressive pushing it downfield. And I ultimately think Georgia's offense, when it's all said and done, could be better than last year. So that's what's kept me off this total, although it does feel like a sneaky under.
I power rated at Georgia 17.2, so it's right there coinciding with my numbers. I'm almost shameful to admit what I was able to get Georgia back in April, but I had no interest, pretty much since that early movement towards Georgia's side here.
Hey, sometimes there are games that are better to watch, or we can use it as a litmus test for sides that have expectations of winning their respective conferences, and there are some games that are better to bet. This apparently will fall into the former category more so than the latter. That'll take us pretty much through the Saturday slate, but let's not kid ourselves. Any of you that have been listeners of the Bet the Board podcast going back to 2014 know there's only one game that matters all of week 1 to one of our particular analysts here, and that game will be taking place Sunday night down at the Caesars Sportsbook Mercedes, whatever the hell they're calling it, Superdome down there in Louisiana, with Florida State taking on the LSU Tigers. And when you look at this game, we'll call it 3 because that's pretty much painted across the board with LSU installed as a short favorite. Total on this game sits at 51.5. And when you dig into this particular matchup, a ton of optimism with Brian Kelly taking over down there at LSU. The major comment and takeaway, if you read any of the preseason posts and all of that, they said it's nice to finally have an adult in the room down there in Baton Rouge. LSU comes into the 2022 campaign after their first sub-500 season since 1999. To put that in historical context, that was actually the year before Nick Saban arrived. Unfortunately for the Seminoles, they've become all too familiar with campaigns under 500, as Florida State went 5-7 last year, their 4th straight season under that threshold. Prior to this streak, FSU had not been under 500 for even a single season since 1976. Which was actually Bobby Bowden's first season at Florida State. When you look at the Noles, though, there is reason for optimism, and it's not because they drummed Duquesne 47-7, a game that I believe both you gentlemen had the underdog in last week. They finished 5-3 over their last 8 after starting the year 0-4. Brad, we'll let you start things. We know Florida State has gradually upgraded their recruiting profile. They look to finally have a capable starting quarterback, but there are still plenty of questions about this team and what they offer up on both the offensive and defensive line, which could pose a problem against LSU's strength, which appears to be NFL caliber defense in their front seven.
Yeah, so you're right. I did have Duquesne last week against Florida State, and I'm here to tell you, I mean, even though Florida State was as vanilla as you could be on both sides of the ball, I mean, I was wishing, praying, hoping for a cover there at the end. So I actually came away, even though Florida State didn't cover, impressed. I mean, it starts with the running backs. I thought all 3 looked good. And I know they're playing a tomato can, but man, Treshaun Ward, Toafili, Benson all ran really hard. I liked on the defensive side of the ball. I thought the FCS transfer defensive end, Jared Verse, stood out a couple of times. I'll say this, matchup-wise, even though you have a first-year coach in Brian Kelly, him and Mike Norvell have faced off the last couple of years. And a positive, I think, for Florida State is, watching that game and watch how, Mike Norvell attacked a Brian Kelly coach defense. I thought he had the better of Brian Kelly both matchups the last couple of years. I thought he had Brian Kelly figured out, at least on that side of the ball. Now, different players, different maybe system, but still, I think that's at least noteworthy. To me, and obviously Payne's going to go much more into the matchups more in depth than me, but I think not only who covers this game, but ultimately who wins this game comes down to how the Florida State offensive line, it feels like a broken record year after year, how do they hold up against what I do think is LSU's strength on their entire team, their defensive line. Flash in the spring game, and obviously has had a good fall camp. How that matchup goes, if Florida State can just hold their own a little bit, if you answer yes to that question, I think Florida State's obviously a live dog here. If they can't, match up well and they can't handle LSU's defensive line, then obviously it's going to be a long Sunday night for Mr. Payne.
You know, Payne, I think Brad led us perfectly. I mean, when you look at LSU, all three of their team captains named earlier this week come on the defensive side of the ball. Ali Gay up front, B.J. Ojulari, and Mike Jones Jr. Ojulari was also named preseason first-team All-SEC. We know how big a deal it is for players down there on the Bayou to wear the number 18. But what's interesting when you dig into his numbers, 5.5 of his sacks came in non-conference play, more so than against SEC caliber opposition. But the big player to watch, Mason Smith, who's drawing all sorts of comparison to one of LSU's great defensive tackles in Glenn Dorsey. Does Florida State finally have enough in the trenches to at least slow down LSU's defensive front?
That's the biggest question on this side of the ball. And I think it also, within that, is can FSU run efficiently to keep from being in these known passing situations where LSU's defensive line can pin their ears back and get after Jordan Travis. And the one thing that we saw this year, right, Florida State went out, enhanced their depth, and raised the floor of the offensive line room with the transfer portal and a lot of the freshmen they brought in. I don't think there's any question about that. But I do think it's difficult to say with conviction that the ceiling was raised. And I know Maurice Smith was added back to the depth chart on Tuesday. I'd say he's 50-50 at best. If Smith can't go, Florida State's on their third-string center now. The other interesting part is when you do look at LSU, some of the metrics and the priors that carry over, I don't know if they're good comps, right? Like you looked at LSU last year, they were 89th in adjusted line yards. They were 93rd in opportunity rate. You could run on them, but there's some noise in those numbers due to all the injuries and how much did they actually care. If LSU can contain FSU's ground game, you could have a similar situation to last year where, you know, Florida State struggled in these known situations to block. 2.3 seconds was the average time it took for pressure to arrive in known passing situations. 159 total pressures allowed and a 37% pressure rate. When you only factor third down in known passing situations where, again, like defenses have one goal, right? Kill the quarterback. FSU allowed a 44% pressure rate and 18% sack rate, and that led to a FSU offense that was 117th in late down success rate. I think we know FSU's made some, concerted efforts to enhance their screen pass game, specifically with Micah Pittman. That's one way to combat pressure with the quick pass attack. The running backs do a really good job catching it out of the backfield. And to Brad's point, they went extremely vanilla and just ran the ball. But I think you'll see guys like Toafili and Trayshawn Ward catch balls out of the backfield this game. Heading into the season, right, like Brad hit it perfectly, LSU's strength is their defensive line. B.J. Ojulari, 15% pressure rate on pass rushing snaps. Ali Gay, his season was cut short, but through 4 games, 16% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. On the interior, you mentioned Mason Smith. He was a top 20 recruit. The word is he's in much better shape, but he didn't really have like the best freshman season. You also got Mekhi Wingo, a 4-star transfer from Missouri who played well as a freshman up the middle. And then you have Roy as well, who graded out the best returning LSU defender. I think we're going to see just a completely different LSU defense this season, right? They're going to be buttoned up. You're going to see more energy and effort. I am obviously familiar with Matt House, former Kansas City Chiefs linebacker coach. He spent time as Kentucky's DC with Mark Stoops, and he was fantastic there, right? Like House inherited a Kentucky defense that was 93rd in schedule-adjusted efficiency 2 seasons later. Kentucky was 15th. So my gut says LSU's secondary is also better than people think. Chemistry, certainly a question mark in game 1 because there's so many new faces, but you look at the guys they brought in, Bernard Converse, right? Transfers in from Oklahoma State. He graded out the Pokes' second best player in the secondary on a historically good Oklahoma State defense that finished top 5. Mekhi Garner, the Louisiana transfer. He's been one of the most valuable corners the last 2 seasons. And then Colby Richardson put on 20 pounds this offseason. He's flashed in camp, getting a lot of first-team reps. The LSU defense, right, in a hostile environment, that could give FSU's offense some troubles here.
You mentioned the hostile environment. I'll come right back to you. When you look at this number, do you feel that there's enough home field advantage built into this price? Is that why you think we're at 3 instead of this game maybe being closer to a pick'em if it was a true neutral type atmosphere?
So I know Brad didn't divulge, and I don't want to spoil his party, but this opened substantially higher. And it's 6.5 earlier this summer. I know Brad and I talked about the game. We thought that was a little bit high. And it got all the way down to 2.5. And then some of the reports about LSU being substantially more buttoned up, even though they don't quite have the depth, we saw a move back the other way. It got out, guys were laying LSU minus 2.5. It feels like I'm sitting somewhere in like the 3.4 range because you do have to factor in a home field advantage for LSU here with the game being in the Superdome.
Can I
no
say something, though? I mean, from the reports that I have read, Florida State sold 30,000 plus tickets to this, so I don't know if it's going to be as hostile as what some people are making it out to be. I mean, quasi home game with it being in New Orleans. No, I think Florida State's going to be very well represented.
I hope so. I do think there is going to be a home field advantage. What does that stadium hold? Is that like 90,000, something like that? So, I did give LSU a little bit of a home field advantage.
No, I did.
I incorporate anything in your numbers, Brad? Okay. Yeah. That's I was at a 1.5. So I think we're kind of in line there, which does indicate, right, that LSU is a little bit better power rated for us, but they're both in that range. And this game's massive, I think, for both teams in terms of, potential trajectory. If Florida State can get a win like this and you start 2-0, and that's one thing we said last year, is Florida State came on towards the end of the year, but based upon early recruiting times, right, the early commitment classes, like you would rather start fast, and then you can blame injuries and a lack of depth on why you finish the season like shit. But you have guys like Hakeem Williams, who is strongly considering Florida State among Pittsburgh and Texas A&M. If you can get out to an early start, you're probably in a good position there. I don't know if you can hold on to them, right, with the Texas A&M money that's out there, but you might be able to get that verbal commitment if you can start this season 3-1.
Hey, I mean, you mentioned 30,000 tickets being sold, Brad. There are plenty of games that I've seen at Doak Campbell over the last handful of years that didn't even have 30,000 fans in attendance. So if Florida State's willing to travel, I think it speaks to the level of optimism this program has, and it would be a massive win for them to build some momentum. But one of the unifying themes that both
keep it up, and you might have someone missing from attendance for a bachelor party and a wedding there, buddy boy.
Well, I'll have to see what I have on the depth chart. I don't think I have anybody capable of filling your shoes, unfortunately, so you're stuck whether you like it or not. But both of you guys have honestly used the term buttoned up quite a bit in some of the games that we've broken down, and obviously as it pertains to everything going on here. One of the players that LSU recruited came from a program that was anything but buttoned up, and that'll be the man projected by many to be their starting quarterback on Sunday night in Jaden Daniels. And Brad, when you look at Jaden Daniels, I mean, there's high expectations for the ASU transfer. We know about the dual threat ability, but he's a player that's seriously regressed over his time in Tempe under Herm Edwards. LSU is extremely talented at the wide receiver position. Getting Keyshawn Butte back is a huge boon, one of the best receivers in the country, a guy who most likely will go in the top 10. There are question marks as far as their backfield, though, with John Emery. No one is exactly sure of his suspension status, but it's not like he's the only back. You have a former Penn State running back in Noah Cain that could slot into the lead role. But when you look at this LSU offense, what are some of your expectations going into the season?
More questions than answers, to be perfectly blunt. I mean, I'm not a big Jaden Daniels fan, especially after his true freshman season. You hit the nail on the head. He's regressed. I mean, so much to the point that, I mean, last season, not only statistically a disappointment, but when he hit the transfer portal, there's those videos out there. I mean, they actually celebrated Arizona State, his departure. I think he obviously starts the season, but I would not be a bit surprised Garrett Nussmeier is your end-of-season starter for LSU. He just, to me, fits more of a mold that Brian Kelly's probably more comfortable with, like an Ian Book, Tommy Rees type. Jaden Daniels, I also question, can he hold up an entire season? Now, and there was always those question marks at Arizona State as far as his stature or lack thereof, but SEC defenses are going to hit home a little harder than Pac-12 defenses. So I think it's a pretty big question mark. I'll say this, offensively, I'm not a huge Mike Denbrock fan. I look at how Cincinnati reacted. I think they were kind of happy that Denbrock decided to take the job, and he's got familiarity with Kelly in the past. But I don't know if he's going to be a type of guy that's more on the up and up as far as tempo or whatnot, and having more of a 2022 style offense. I think it's going to be rather vanilla, especially for this game. So I think on Payne's behalf, he's looking for some optimism. I think Florida State can have some success against this LSU offense.
Payne, are you going to echo Brad's sentiments? Do you believe in your Noles defense and their ability to match up?
I think there's so much variance on this side of the ball. I really do. I mean, LSU obviously has some offensive line question marks as well, right? Garrett Dillinger is the first team center. He was a freshman last year. He played on the left side of the line, showed well there, but he's never played center before, not even in high school. He was recovering from off-season shoulder surgery, so he didn't play during spring camp, and the word is that he's had lots of low snaps during camp. You have true freshman Will Campbell, who's starting at left tackle. I think he's going to be a beast. He's a 5-star kid, top 40 player in the 2021 class, but he has struggles with power. So, you look at this line across the board. Miles Frazier, the FIU transfer, played tackle, now moving to guard. He's a guy Alex Atkins in Florida State passed on to upgrade their offensive line. You have Anthony Bradford. He played 288 snaps over 3 seasons. He's graded out below average in that limited work. He's being kicked inside to right guard. And then you have Cam Wire, who won the right tackle job in 3 seasons. He's played roughly 800 snaps. He's graded out below average. I think the question mark is, does Florida State have the pieces to stalemate LSU's ground game and get pressure on the quarterback? It does help that John Emery is suspended. I know Adam Fuller didn't do anything exotic, and he kept it extremely vanilla. But 6 negative plays created, just 3 pressures. It was a very disappointing effort from Florida State's defensive line, not just being able to manhandle Duquesne in the trenches. And I remember going back to our ACC preview in June, and forward-facing analysts were projecting FSU to have, the 11th ranked schedule-adjusted defense. And I was in shock seeing that. I would be happy if Florida State finished somewhere in the top 25. I know a lot of guys return, and Florida State's defense trended well late. 5 of the 6 final offenses were held to 39% success rate or lower last season. But if you look, where is the pressure going to come from? FSU lost 77% of its defensive end pressures, 81% of its defensive end sacks. Jermaine Johnson was a first-round pick. Keir Thomas, a former SEC player, 5th-year senior last year, just made the Rams' 53-man roster. Verse, Briggs, and McClendon are relative unknowns. And to Brad's point, Verse has all the potential in the world to be special. He is the one true pass rusher Florida State has, but he's young. He played at Albany. It's a big step up. He doesn't really have a secondary move. So all 3 of those guys need to play well here. LSU's receiver group with Boutte and Neighbors, I think they could give Florida State trouble. I am actually very nervous about Florida State's defensive backs. They're either really young or they're older guys that have battled injuries and haven't played well. Florida State's number 1 corner, Marion Cooper, missed the opener, didn't participate in warmups, was seen walking with a limp last week. I don't know if he plays or not. He was on the depth chart. Let's see. The other thing that's interesting is Brian Kelly didn't officially announce a starting quarterback yet. Now, he believes it's a tactical advantage, and I'll be honest, I do too. I do think Jaden Daniels gets the job, but him and Garrett Nessmeyer are polar opposites. And my hunch is that Jaden Daniels is out there. He gets the first crack at it because LSU's offensive line probably has some question marks, and his mobility helps that. And the one thing you do, if you throw in the tape last year, Adam Fuller's defense struggled at times with mobile quarterbacks. There was a 3-game stretch last year where FSU played Louisville. Malik Cunningham had 2 rushing touchdowns and a positive .28 EPA per rush. Following week, Syracuse quarterback Garrett Schrader, 143 rushing yards when you remove sacks, 3 rushing touchdowns, a positive .31 EPA per rush. The week after that, Sam Howell, 111 rushing yards. There could also be an interesting situation here, and I do think we see Garrett Nessmeyer at some point, but what if LSU's offensive line is holding up extremely well because Florida State's defensive line is a little bit overrated, and Jaden Daniels isn't connecting with receivers? Nessmeyer is the better thrower, and I think we know Florida State's secondary struggled to get off the field last year on 3rd down, 94th in the country in 3rd down conversions allowed. I am a little nervous about Florida State's secondary. Again, it's a lot of young kids. It's a lot of upperclassmen that have not proven themselves. It makes me nervous, right? Like a week before the final transfer period, you're adding Malik Feaster, who's an FCS level cornerback to the roster. Makes me a little nervous. I think this unit's a little bit down compared to what the market believes.
Brad, let's hope Florida State shows up on Sunday for Payne's emotional well-being and peace of mind. Otherwise, this might be the first and last time that we have to do a deep dive on any Seminoles football game throughout the course of the fall. But definitely a contest worth watching. I know a lot of LSU fans believe that the program only has one way to go but up, and Florida State brimming with confidence that Mike Norvell can finally get this program headed in the right direction for what's been a slow rebuild, but one that I think has progressed the way it needs to maintain sustainability going forward instead of a fly-by-night program. Brad, I mean, if this is the first foray that you've had with the Bet the Board listenership, I mean, you've passed with flying colors. So if Payne, comes down with, a sickness or anything else, we know we're in good hands going forward. Can't thank you enough for jumping into the fold. We were so excited to get you on board coming into this season. And the first episode, listening to you guys go back and forth is any indication. I know how much smarter I've gotten, let alone what our listeners are going to do to make them sharper, much more sophisticated handicappers going forward, especially as they pertain to the big games we'll break down all season.
And I can't thank you guys enough for having me. And I'm sure I'll be getting some nasty texts after we get off the podcast from somebody that I went after a little bit on this podcast.
That's the only way we do things around here, and I'm not even going to give him a chance to defend himself. I'll let you guys take that off the air. Best of luck this weekend, Brad, with you. I'm sure will be north of 100 bets by the time you finish out your FCS
Absolutely.
Portfolio. Man, bringing Brad in to get you two going back and forth and allow me to play point guard to kind of facilitate the dialogue, I might just flip on the microphone, show up 15 minutes before we're set to record, and it's going to make my life a hell of a lot easier, giving me a chance to deep dive every game on the slate, even the ones that we're not breaking down.
Yeah, you can't get off that easy. And then when you do speak, you just throw jabs the entire time. That can't be.
There is no doubt having an ally now in Brad. He took to it like a fish to water, throwing haymakers coming off the top rope. If you could have seen the shit-eating grin on my face, ear to ear, when he just decides, you know what, I might be the new guy in the fold, but I'm not going to hold back. I loved it, and it warmed my heart. And it's part of the reason I know both you and I work so hard this offseason. You a little harder than me. Not just this offseason, but even going back a little bit further to make sure that Brad could be a part of Bet the Board, and I couldn't be more excited to add another extremely talented handicapper to the fold.
Completely agree. And I think the one thing probably that comes off, and it's not overly accurate, is we might be a little rough around the edges and have prickly textures, but when we let somebody into the family, they're in. And the one thing that I've noticed about Brad is obviously wildly talented, and we do some work together outside of the forward-facing stuff, but just a good human. And that's kind of what we want to associate with in this space. And so very fortunate to have Brad joining us all fall long for the college football element. And hey, he may be doing a standalone podcast some point in October when we are celebrating your eventual nuptials.
Yeah, I would say impending nuptials. We'll get to that, and we'll share a little bit more details on that, because we may do something with Bet the Board that we've never done before, but I don't want all of our listeners to be extremely disappointed in us giving ourselves a de facto bye week, not only from the football side, but haven't told Worm that he may have to do it for Stay Green as well. So it's a good thing that we've brought in some guest analysts to try and cover it. But to your point, the reason that our podcast has been so successful over the years, since we started back in 2014, is it takes a lot for us to welcome someone into our fold. And we've had weekly guests, we've had annual contributors, and we feel they always add a dimension to take what we do to the next level. And Brad is the perfect embodiment. I think people are truly going to enjoy not just the 6 games, or I guess 6.5, given the Boise State, Oregon State breakdown that we saw today, but everything that they're going to get from Brad going forward. And again, we encourage you to follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. He does a ton of media throughout the course of the week. So if there's games that we can't cover here, there is no doubt in some capacity Brad is going to get to them one way or another to try and peel back the curtain in some of the process. So no doubt about it, going to be one of the best seasons that we've had on the college side. But all that being said, Payne, we've done the homework. We've done the heavy lifting. We've talked about it at great length, said, hey, look, week 1 can be difficult, not necessarily from an efficiency standpoint, but so many of these numbers have been up for months. They're beaten, they're battered, and I know a lot of our listeners are clamoring for what will be our first regular season best bet, but unfortunately, it's not the same market that we're betting into when we will be on Wednesdays throughout the course of this season. So I say all of that to preface our best bet that, hey, look, we tried to dig, we went far and wide, and I'm very curious where you've identified the week 1 investment opportunity.
Yeah, don't necessarily love giving out something this quickly, but to your point, the market's a little beaten up at this point, so we are actually going to a game that is this evening, and it's a game that we broke down. It'll be time-stamped above if you want to go back and hear what Brad and I had to say along with Todd, but it's rotation number 143. We're going to go with the West Virginia Mountaineers team total under 21.5 points. So just basic synopsis going back to what we discussed already. We think Pittsburgh's offense is going to be a little bit more methodical, running the ball, chewing clock. That means less possessions for West Virginia. Pittsburgh's defense returns a slew of returning production, probably one of the top 10 defensive lines. They also return a ton of guys in the secondary as well, which should, help combat JT Daniels and that passing offense. Not a ton of weapons for West Virginia either. Lost their best running back, lost their best pass catcher. So I think this game's going to be a little bit lower scoring, and we see that in the totals market for both teams. We saw some money come in under there. So Pittsburgh obviously took some money as well. So this lends itself to a nice little correlation to West Virginia's team total under, and again, under 21.5 points there for West Virginia.
It's always amazing on this podcast. It's 6 degrees of Stetson Bennett separation here. And so we know you're the leader of the Stetson Bennett fan club. You take shots at JT Daniels. Brad comes off the top rope saying he doesn't think JT's as good as anybody out there. But to your point, I think it could operate in fits and spurts. This is a West Virginia team that's had a very disrupted camp as far as continuity with their starting quarterback. And the one thing we know about Pitt is how tenacious they are in their defensive front. I'm just thrilled as a college football fan that this backyard brawl is back in the mix. They're saying it could be a record crowd at whatever the hell they're calling it now. For me, it'll always be Heinz Field. So we're going to root for West Virginia's offense to struggle. And let's hope Signetti and Narduzzi decide to run the football, run it early, run it often, bleed that clock, and get us out of Dodge, keeping West Virginia comfortably under that number. So, my friend, first regular season podcast officially in the books. I know it probably went a little bit longer than you anticipated, but yes. I really felt like all the information out there was presented in a succinct manner. I know there were a lot of marquee games that people are going to run to try and bet, so hopefully we gave them enough nuggets to justify whatever positions they want to take over the weekend.
Yeah, this was a podcast that as we were recording it, we're like, boy, time just flew. It was very fluid in our conversations and discussions, but I will say it ran a little long, but there was just a ton of marquee games that were covering multiple days, and I think we'll have a little bit more of a normalized schedule moving forward and not so many marquee matchups that we need to deep dive into. So I think we'll end up kind of getting these back at the normal rate of time that we had last year, and that, 75-minute mark.
Hey, anytime you integrate new pieces, the cadence is always a little bit different, but the information remains best in class, and that's what you guys have come to expect as longtime listeners of the Bet the Board podcast. I know it's the college show, and I should have introduced it towards the top, but again, want to remind all of you, as we've done throughout the course of our NFL previews, we have a great NFL contest that we encourage all of you to sign up for. So when you're spending time with your friends, your family, and everybody else this weekend, tell them to go to bettheboard.com. contest.com. Sign up, absolutely free. So people that may only have a passing interest in the NFL, they're not put out by it. You can win swag, you can win cash and prizes, and most importantly, if you happen to rise to the top of the heap, you can get a trophy of Payne's bust that you can prominently display in your man cave or on your mantle throughout the course of the year. All kidding aside, we haven't done that trophy yet, but want to encourage people to do that. Any final words of wisdom, parting shots, life advice that you'd like to offer up? Maybe a cocktail that you encourage people to try, because this is essentially the unofficial end of summer for folks across the country, not necessarily for me in the desert or you down there in South Florida.
Yeah, life has been over for me for over a month now. So football season is officially here. As Todd alluded to, NFL contest, pick 5. You'll have until the first Sunday of NFL season to get those picks in and join the contest. Over $6,000 in year-long prizes. We also award a weekly winner for all 18 weeks. Over $10,000 in cash prizes. Absolutely free to join. BetTheBoardContest.com. The link will be in the podcast description. It'll take you directly there.
I've already told my family members they're not eligible for those prizes. I think Pops gets pissed that we don't send him all the swag that you and I wear. But you know what? You got to earn some of that stuff out there, and all the listeners will have a chance to try and do that. So from all of us here at Bet the Board to all of you guys, be smart, be safe, enjoy your Labor Day weekend and the long weekend. Hopefully you've enjoyed the first regular season college football podcast of the season. They're only going to get better as we continue to go forward. But most importantly, with a West Virginia team total ticket in hand come Thursday evening, hopefully we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.